The growth and spread of Islam. With the death of Muhammad, the future of Islam was suddenly uncertain. Muhammad had been the prophetic leader of the Muslims, but he had chosen no successor. The immediate question was, who would now lead the Muslims? Would there be another leader with a prophetic gift like Muhammad's to give them guidance? Some said that Muhammad had chosen his nephew Ali on his trip back to Medina from the pilgrimage to Mecca, but others denied it. The Muslims of Medina and Mecca both wanted to choose a new leader from their own members. To hold off the rising divisions, a small committee of representatives from Mecca and Medina quickly chose Abu Bakr, the father of Muhammad's wife Aisha, because Muhammad had chosen him to lead prayers in his place before he died. Abu Bakr took for himself the title of Caliph, or deputy to the Prophet. He and the next three leaders who ruled after him were later known as the rightly guided caliphs. They were all from the Arab tribe of Quraysh and were tied by blood or marriage to Muhammad, and they ruled from Medina over the early Islamic Empire. As Muhammad had expanded his power in Arabia, many of the Arab tribes had joined with him out of self-interest and become Muslims as Muhammad had required of them. But now with Muhammad gone, they felt no need to continue being Muslims and wanted to repudiate the agreements they had made. These widespread defections threatened to tear apart the young Muslim community. The Caliph Abu Bakr then declared that if anyone left Islam, it was an act of apostasy punishable by death. He said once someone became a Muslim, and thus a servant of God by joining Muhammad, he was never free to stop being a Muslim. In addition, Abu Bakr said no one could be a real Muslim unless he was submitted to the one who was chosen to be leader of all Muslims. He also declared that Muhammad was the last prophet of God, based on a verse in the Quran calling Muhammad the seal of the prophets. Under Abu Bakr's rule, the apostasy of rebelling tribes in Arabia was vigorously suppressed, and the beginnings of outward conquest began. Now that all Arabs had become Muslim brothers, they weren't supposed to raid one another anymore, and the resources of Arabia alone could not support a new Muslim state. To finance his state and to give encouragement to Muslims through material success not to withdraw from the community, Abu Bakr encouraged raids and conquests into the Byzantine Christian areas north of Arabia, into the areas of modern-day Syria and Iraq. During his reign, the Quran also began to be written down. After one major battle against those trying to leave Islam, many of the Muslims who knew the Quran by memory were killed, and Abu Bakr gave orders for the message of the Quran to be collected and written down before they could be lost to memory. Abu Bakr ruled for 2 years and then died in 634 AD. Before he died, he nominated his own successor, Umar. Umar ruled from 634 to 644 AD. He continued Abu Bakr's policy of organizing and channeling the Muslim conquest outward. Umar also established the administrative base of the empire, creating the offices of judges and establishing fixed taxes. He made arrangements for the disposition of the booty from the conquests, which was the main source of income for the growing empire. Under Umar, Islam became a world power. The final conquest of Damascus came in 636. By 640, Roman control in Syria was over. By 641, the Muslims controlled all the territory west of the Zagros Mountains in Iran. During the years 642 to 646, Egypt was taken, and soon thereafter began the raids into the Maghrib, the lands west of Egypt. Shortly thereafter in the east, Iran fell. Conversion of the conquered peoples to Islam came usually by the sword, or more slowly afterwards because of the oppression non-Muslims faced under humiliating laws and taxes the Muslim conquerors imposed on those who wouldn't convert. As Islam developed, its basic forms and practices became more crystallized. The 5 pillars of Islam and the Sunnah, or guiding example of Muhammad's life, became established for Muslims as the way for them to show Islam. Special Friday prayers, with a sermon afterwards, became an established institution. Umar was assassinated by a Persian Christian slave in the year 644. After Umar's assassination, Uthman, who was married to 2 of Muhammad's daughters, became the next caliph, and he ruled from 644 to 656. He was a weak compromise candidate chosen by a committee when stronger opposing parties like Ali had been cancelled out. As the Islamic Empire continued expanding, Uthman tried to strengthen the central control over it. He belonged to the Umayyad clan of Mecca, and he began to place his own clan and family into positions of power and authority throughout the empire. There was much resentment against this cronyism, as most of the wealth coming in from the conquests went directly to his own family. Uthman also established the official version of the Quran and ordered all copies of the Quran which differed from his to be destroyed. These things stirred up various rebellions by Muslims against his rule, and in one such rebellion he was murdered. Ali was chosen to be the next caliph, and he ruled from 656 to 661. He was the nephew of Muhammad, married to his daughter Fatima, and was the closest male heir that Muhammad had. He acquired a corrupt state of affairs from Uthman, which he tried to rectify, but he ended up just alienating the powerful Quraysh of Mecca who had grown rich on the Muslim conquests. A three-way contest for control began between Ali, Aisha, the daughter of Abu Bakr, and Muawiyah of the Umayyads, the clan of the murdered Caliph Uthman. Outwardly, the conflict focused on whether Uthman had been assassinated justly and whether Ali was involved since he hadn't punished the murderers, and whether Uthman's death should be avenged. Muawiyah, as a kinsman of Uthman's, had the duty of revenge. There were various armed rebellions against Ali, and he was assassinated in a mosque after one rebellion he put down. This was the first of the 4 fitnas in Islam. Fitna means strife or rebellion. These fitnas were later historically viewed as major trials that tested the strength and unity of Islam in its early years. The first fitna from 656 to 661 was the struggle in Ali's reign between Ali, Aisha, and Muawiyah. After Ali's death, Muawiyah, the Umayyad opponent of Ali, gained control and became the next caliph. He had been the leader of the Muslim military in Damascus, and he transferred the capital of the Islamic Empire from Medina to Damascus. This began the Umayyad dynasty of caliphs, who ruled over Islam from Damascus between 661 to 750 AD. The second fitna ran through the reigns of Muawiyah and his son Yazid from 661 to 683 and continued along much the same lines as the first fitna, with the struggle now being between Ali's descendants and Muawiyah's descendants over who would lead Islam. When Ali died, his 2 sons, Hussein and Hassan, were both bought off, and they eventually agreed to obey Muawiyah as their leader. But when Muawiyah died and his dissolute son Yazid became the caliph, Hussein led a rebellion, and in Karbala, Iraq, Hussein and his men were defeated, and he was butchered. For the Shiite Muslims who felt the line of Ali was the only legitimate one for a leader, the death of Hussein was a great tragedy, and every year Shiites commemorate his death on the festival of Ashura, cutting themselves with knives and whips in an emotional frenzy. As Caliph, Muawiyah further developed the administration of the Islamic Empire, fashioning it in imitation of the opulent Byzantine and Persian empires which the Muslims had conquered. He depended heavily on non-Arab administrative personnel and also made the leadership hereditary through his own family rather than through Muhammad's line. Future Muslims have looked down upon him, the Sunni majority for his turning away from the pattern of leadership by making the rule hereditary and not chosen by committee, and the Shiites for his not being from Muhammad's family. During the Umayyad dynasty, the basic rules of life for Muslims became further crystallized. It was during the Umayyad dynasty that the hadith, or stories about what Muhammad said and did, began to be collected. As Muslims watched the growing corruption of Islam and its leaders, there was a desire by many to view Muhammad as the perfect example for a Muslim to follow, and many stories and anecdotes about Muhammad circulated, which later became, along with the Quran, one of the main sources for Islamic law and guidance. These stories were supposed to be based on what someone actually heard or saw Muhammad say and do, but many were made up well after Muhammad's time, often to just make a point. Many imaginary happenings and miracles were also attributed to Muhammad. As Muslims came into greater contact with the rest of the world, they also came into contact with Christians who knew the Bible, and when it became obvious that the Bible disagreed with the Quran, Muslims developed the argument in reaction of saying that the Bible had been corrupted. At the end of the Umayyad period in 750 AD, the third fitna began, which resulted in a new and final dynasty of caliphs called the Abbasids. Ever since the start of the Umayyad dynasty, a number of concerned and self-conscious Muslims had begun to raise serious questions about the proper Muslim life and how poorly the Umayyads exemplified it. The question was again, who is the right one to rule the Muslims? Was it someone who was of Muhammad's tribe, or of his own male descendants only? Was it the one best qualified by a devout Muslim life? Or should Muslims just accept as God's will whoever took over? The Umayyad dynasty were seen as corrupt and immoral by a growing number of Muslims who questioned their right to power. The Umayyads were accused of bid'ah, new actions for which there were no legitimate Islamic precedents. The first 4 caliphs were viewed as being legitimate leaders, while the Umayyads were seen as illegitimate by their actions. The first 4 caliphs possessed special learning and knowledge, it was believed, but under the Umayyads the caliphate had been reduced to a military and administrative office lacking in any true spiritual legitimacy. In 750 AD, a movement from Iran called the Abbasids led a rebellion of different groups seeking change that finally defeated the Umayyads. Some of those taking part in the rebellion were of the party that wanted to install one of Ali's descendants as leader and were called the Shia, or Party of Ali. They were led to believe that their cause would be favored once the Abbasids succeeded. But after becoming victorious, the Abbasid leader wanted to keep all the Muslims together in one community, and he made compromises with those who disagreed with the Shia position. The Shia minority refused to accept the compromise and withdrew, while the majority group, called People of the Sunnah or Sunni, accepted the Abbasids. Thus the division between the 2 major sections of Islam, the Sunnis and Shiites, became established. In areas of doctrine and faith, the 2 groups later developed very distinctly from one another. The Shiites began to see themselves as a party of revival in opposition to the majority. The Abbasids founded the city of Baghdad in Iraq and made it their new capital. Though they had started their dynasty in rejection of the Umayyads for ruling Islam illegitimately, the Abbasids continued in much the same fashion, becoming even more bureaucratic, more opulent, and worldly. Unconverted Jews and Christians could be influential at court, and the same decline was seen that brought the fall of the earlier dynasty. However, to help justify their leadership of Islam, the Abbasids fostered the study of Islamic law, which later developed into the Sharia, the religious law that governs a Muslim. According to Sharia, a ruler was bound to follow Islamic law as much as an ordinary Muslim, and this in the end helped to undermine the absolute authority of the caliphate. The 4th fitna occurred 200 years after Muhammad's death during the reign of the Abbasid ruler Al-Ma'mun, who ruled from 813 to 833 AD. In the same way that the early Christian church struggled with controversies over whether Christ was both fully human and fully divine, early Muslims had their own controversies. Part of this likely came about as a result of the greater interaction with Christians and Jews, who taught that God is always righteous in all his ways. For Muslims, the controversy centered on whether the Quran had been created or was eternal. Freethinkers among the Muslims, called Mu'tazilites, reasoned that the Quran had to have been created, because otherwise it would deny the absolute unity of God. They especially wanted to avoid a literal interpretation of the Quran, which discouraged free will and produced many embarrassing inconsistencies. For example, the Quran says God has predestined men to heaven or hell, but the freethinkers believed that God must save the righteous as well as punish the unrighteous. By arguing that the Quran was created in time, the freethinkers could justify interpreting verses metaphorically and allow for changing interpretations as circumstances changed. By implication, the hadith, or stories about Muhammad's actions, were then less authoritative, as Muhammad's example was good for his times, but not necessarily for all times. The Caliph al-Ma'mun agreed with the freethinkers and harshly persecuted those who disagreed with him. The majority of Muslims, however, strongly disagreed with the freethinkers and felt that viewing the Quran as created would invalidate its absolute authority, and they argued for an eternal Quran. They said the Quran was somehow a part of God. They also didn't believe that God had to save the righteous or had to punish the unrighteous, that he was free to do anything he wanted. They also emphasized the importance of Muhammad's example to be able to truly understand the Quran. This Sunni or majority belief prevailed, with the orthodox belief being established that the Quran forever existed as an eternal book in heaven, al-Kitab, or the mother of the book, and the earthly Quran given to Muhammad considered to be a manifestation of the heavenly one, which is an interesting parallel to the living Word of God, Jesus Christ, who became flesh and dwelt among us. For Orthodox Sunnis, Muhammad's life, as revealed in the Hadith, was also recognized as the highest example for Muslims to follow. After much popular discontent, the Caliph's successor finally backed down and stopped the persecution, giving in to the will of the majority, which greatly weakened the authority of the Caliphate. After this, there were numerous rebellions, and by 870 AD, the empire had become fragmented, with alternate Muslim states and even alternate caliphates being established, for example in Spain and Egypt. There were certain factors which brought unity to Muslims, similar practices of worship, the pilgrimage, Ramadan, etc., but the Muslim community, as amplified in the caliphate, was never again re-established. Although different Muslim empires arose whose rulers claimed to be caliphs, none ever ruled over the whole of Islam again. One main goal of modern Islamic revivalist movements is the re-establishment of the caliphate. Even after the decline of the caliphate, though, Islam continued to expand into new areas, and one major factor in its growth was the work of devout Muslim mystics called Sufis. Sufis brought Islam into areas like India, Central Asia, Turkey, and Sub-Saharan Africa. These missionary mystics utilized poetry and song and idealized Muhammad to the point of worshiping him. They often incorporated into Islam the religious practices and traditions of the people they converted, making Islam more acceptable to the masses, for example by allowing and encouraging the worship of saints and various folk magic practices. Arab and Indian Muslim traders were also responsible for another large expansion of Islam from the 13th to the 17th centuries into places like Indonesia, Malaysia, and China. Important mention needs to be made here of the Christian Crusades, which lasted for nearly 200 years from the 12th to the 14th centuries. At the Council of Clermont in 1095, Pope Urban II responded to an appeal from the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, for help against attacking Muslim Turks. To help restore relations with the Eastern Church and to take back the holy city of Jerusalem, the First Crusade was launched the following year and resulted in the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099. This was a time when the Christian Church, under attack for centuries by the Muslim world, became enthused with the Muslim concept of holy war, and in areas like Spain, the Christians fought Muslims for la reconquista, the reconquest of lands that had once been Christian. The Christian Crusaders in Palestine were finally defeated, but the negative effects of the Crusades can still be seen in the relationships and attitudes toward the Christian world felt by Muslims today. In Muslim Spain, the Muslims were defeated and pushed out of the land they had called Andalusia after nearly 800 years of rule. For many Muslims, the loss of Andalusia is still felt as a defeat that must one day be reversed. Much of the rest of the history of Islam, up until the 18th century, is a long account of various Islamic states and empires rising and falling in power in the different parts of the Muslim world. The last Muslim empire claiming caliphate status was the Ottoman Empire, which began in the 14th century and lasted until March of 1924, when Turkey became a republic and formally abolished the caliphate. Since then, no caliphate has existed, nor has one been claimed. The corruption and backwardness of the Muslim lands, together with the rising power of Europe after the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, brought about the next stage in Islamic history, the colonization and domination of Muslim lands by the West, which lasted up until the end of World War II. Europe, since the 17th century, had been gradually growing more powerful by the wealth coming in from the new worlds opened up in the age of exploration, by the technological advances of the Industrial Revolution, and also importantly from the influence of the moral ethic of the Protestant Reformation. By the 18th century, the military superiority of the Western powers was clearly evident, even to the Muslim world. Within the Caliphate of the Ottoman Empire, the response to this was a growing desire to imitate the West, and everything European was seen as best. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as the Europeans expanded their empires around the world, many lands, including Muslim ones, were brought under the control of the European powers. Not all Muslim territories were colonized, but nearly all Muslim lands across the world experienced some kind of dependency, whether psychological, political, technological, cultural, or economic. But the thing was, according to Islam, Muslims were never supposed to be ruled over by non-Muslims. Islam was seen and felt to be in a steep decline. At the end of World War I, the last Muslim caliphate, the Ottoman Empire, was broken up after it sided with Germany, and France and England carved new states out of its former territories, with both powers having zones of influence. In the early part of the 20th century, the growing popularity of Westernization and the decreasing reliance on Islam as a source of public values started to be countered in different parts of the Islamic world by new restoration movements which called on Muslims to return to Islam. Following Islam is the only way back to the glory we once had, was their theme, and has been the theme ever since for revivalist Islam. The Muslim Brotherhood was founded in 1928 by Hassan al-Banna, an Egyptian school teacher who, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the abolition of the Caliphate, lamented the failure of the Ummah or Muslim community. The Muslim Brotherhood's response to this failure was to re-emphasize that Islam encompasses all the affairs of man. The group also emphasizes that Islam is a universal faith and it seeks to spread Islam around the world. The Muslim Brotherhood became the source and inspiration for many later revivalist movements such as Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Al-Qaeda. At the end of World War II, Britain and France, weakened from the great expense and devastation they went through in the war, began to lose control over their empires. There were strong feelings of nationalism everywhere and calls for independence by the colonized lands. Many Muslim lands, along with other colonized territories, finally became independent nations after the war. The spirit of nationalism, with all citizens being equal, Muslims as well as non-Muslims, brought the forging of new identities as people started to see themselves now as Jordanians, Iraqis, Iranians, etc. This put stress on how many Muslims identified themselves. A growing number of Muslims, accustomed to looking at the West as being superior, found themselves becoming disenchanted with the spiritual poverty of materialism which they saw the West teaching. Many started to reconsider their historic Islamic roots and values, and Islam began to see a resurgence in many places. The new Muslim nation-states have sought to implement the Muslim ethic in various ways. Some, like Iraq and Jordan, were more secular, while others, like Iran and Pakistan, adopted Sharia law, with many others falling somewhere in between. As the revival of Islam has continued, there is a growing call in many Muslim nations for their governments to fully adopt Sharia law. An important development affecting modern Muslims occurred in 1948 when Israel became a nation. Israel has become a source of great hostility for the entire Islamic world, with strong Muslim support for the displaced Palestinians who fled during Israel's War of Independence. In the Quran, Surah 265 and 560, Jews are said to be apes and pigs, and according to Islam they are the enemies of God. Yet the small land of Israel was able to establish itself right in the middle of larger Muslim lands and even defeat militarily the combined armies of the Muslim nations that attacked Israel at its creation. Israel's very existence is a source of great shame and anger for Muslims. Another important development for modern Islam was the discovery of oil in the Middle East around World War II, with the vast amounts of wealth that began to flow into Muslim lands after the war period. The strictly fundamentalist Wahhabi leaders of Saudi Arabia have been able to lavishly finance projects to build mosques all over the world and to support the spread of Islam by fundamentalist Islamic movements and Muslim evangelism. Another important development has been the large migrations of Muslims to Europe and the American continent following World War II and the gradual end of colonialism. The outbreak of tribal wars and the more recent phenomenon of ethnic cleansing have displaced millions of people, with a great number of these uprooted immigrants being Muslims, looking for a better life than their homelands have. They have found refuge in the democracies of Australia, Europe, North America, and the United Kingdom. This migration is steady and sizable, and with Islam's prohibitions against birth control and abortion, Muslim families are growing at a rapid rate, while the native populations of these lands are experiencing a steady drop in births, making the eventual takeover of Europe by Muslims a statistical certainty this century. Today, worldwide Islam is in a state of revival and expansion, with a growing influence of the radical branches of Islam. The Christian Church in Europe and the West can no longer afford to ignore its call to reach Muslims for Christ. In our next session, we'll be looking at the beliefs of Muslims. May God bless you.